You're tuned in and locked on. Gay News Radio with Brandon Carmody. Only on the GNR Radio Network.
So you're listening to Gay News Radio. My name is Brandon Carmody. Our guest today is Jennicet Gutiérrez. Welcome so much. Thank you for coming on the show.
Hi. Well, thank you for having me.
So much has happened in our community in recent days since this awful massacre at the Pulse nightclub. I think it's only appropriate that we begin there. What are the immediate impacts that you are feeling today from this tragedy? And I know that you are really plugged in with many members of the community. What are you feeling today, and what are members of the community talking to you about as it relates to this current tragedy?
Yeah, it's really, really hitting home. It's unfortunate that this tragedy happened in the first place. And now as the names are being released of people that were, targeted by this act of violence, it's really heartbreaking for the community. We're like processing with a lot of pain and trying to at the same time trying to like organize events, making sure we are healing together. We are just it was just a big really hit for the community.
Now, in all of your experience, and that includes, everything that you hear from, members of the community of all, our different rainbow spectrum, is this even possible? Is this a possibility that you ever considered what happened to the LGBTQ community, or is this a complete surprise, kind of like our 9/11?
No, it's really not a surprise, because the reality for many transgender women, especially Black and Latina, the violence that we face daily, it's a reality for many of us. If we look at the murders that took place last year in the U.S. alone, we have one of the highest murders that the transgender community faced, and most of the victims were a Black trans woman and Latina trans woman. So today, look at so far June, and we have lost already 11 of our sisters, right? So as an immigrant community, as a transgender community, these acts of violence occur to us daily, but we just don't hear about them often enough or in the mainstream. But it wasn't a surprise. It was just really shocking to see that many people being hit in one moment, right? And just trying to look again the names and just really hit home, because you identify with some of the people that were inside that club.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, what we're looking at in the recent days since the attack at the Pulse nightclub is such a media coverage of this massive event. I mean, let's look at the facts. It's been deemed the worst mass shooting in recent history. This is the largest single attack on an LGBT community that we've ever seen. So it's getting wall-to-wall coverage on every network. Is that helping or hurting us right now in terms of the spotlight being put back on the LGBT community right now?
People can process however they feel, whether it's helping or it's hurting the community, but it is unfortunate that we are having these conversations are based on a tragedy, right, about the violence that we are facing as a community. I think many people aren't ready to have these conversations, so now these conversations are being forced on them. And this is something myself as an activist, we've been involved with the trans community here in LA. These are the conversations that we've been trying to raise to our own LGBT community and the mainstream, and some people are not really comfortable because they are very concerned about the backlash, and this is something that happened here in this case, right? We're dealing with a tremendous amount of backlash. If we look at the legislation that is taking place in so many states throughout the nation, specifically targeting the transgender community. So, some people can argue that it's not for the good because of all this anti-legislation taking place, because of the violence that we are seeing unfolding before our eyes. But to me, the more we become visible, the we more force these conversations. It is my hope that in the long term, it's really going to benefit the community and bring us together.
Definitely. Now, I know I wanted to ask you about your encounter at the White House with United States President Barack Obama. From what I've seen in the news coverage, you were invited to an LGBTQ event at the White House about a year ago, and then there was a moment in the room where you were trying to shout out your message or your information to the president. Can you go ahead and tell our listeners what was the question, or what were you trying to get the president to answer when you were there?
Yes, and you're absolutely correct. Almost a year ago, I was inside the White House, and I was really, challenging the president on the immigration policies, especially around undocumented transgender women inside immigrant detention facilities across the nation. So again, connecting to what's happening to the community in Florida, because I was raised in this violence that we are facing, in society, and the violence that we face inside these detention facilities, right? One of the things that I said, President Obama released all LGBTQ people in detention center, stop the torture and abuse transgender women are facing inside these facilities, and that I'm really sick and tired of the violence, and look what's happening. It's been almost a year, and continues to have all this hateful rhetoric targeting our community. Now we see this major tragedy taking place. So, instead of my community really shutting me down or being concerned about respectability politics, they need to start listening to those most impacted by the violence that we face, not only here nationally, but around the world. So if people will take the time to look at the statistics targeting transgender women globally, it's really staggering. I think it's unfortunate, all of the work that we do as a community and everything, it's really to say what's happening to us. So sometimes people were really arguing that wasn't the right time, the right moment. But if we don't take those risks, then when is the right time, right? So
right.
It's something that I believe, the trans community, the gender nonconforming community, have been really screaming for years. Let's look at the Stonewall. Let's look at how things started. It was people standing up against police brutality. This is an act of violence that was happening to us. And look at Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson. They were just doing things that moving the movement forward. So this is really nothing new, the violence that we face. It's for so many people it might be, and they're shocked, and they're trying to process or make sense of all that is happening. But this is something that we experience daily in our lives.
Well, and what I want to, and I'm trying to give you a platform to get the message across to our listeners, but I want to preface it with this. Even I was really confused by your interruption, and this is where I would like to ask you to get really honest about the president and what's going on. But from my point of view, you have President Obama, who is the first sitting U.S. president to come out on television. Remember that I feel it's important for same-sex couples to have the right to get married, and then he supported the Supreme Court decision in Obergefell v. Hodges. He was having this LGBT event at the White House, and then from our point of view, there was a protester, a disruptor, and so it was really out of place. So I think I know how you would answer this, but why not go through proper channels, schedule a meeting, or go through back channels? Why a public disruption? Why not try to get a more formal meeting or audience with the president?
Because the reality is, for transgender women, especially transgender women of color, especially if you add another layer of complexity to our identity, like undocumented people, right? We don't have a place at the table. mainstream LGBT organizations, I invite you to go to any local orgs that are specifically for the LGBT community and look at the body that represents the organizations. And if you tell me that there are transgender women, especially of color, making decisions, then that will answer your question, because we don't have the platform, we don't have access to the resources to really go the right way, or whatever that means, or however that looks like. However, we do want to say that this specific issue is something that has been worked with the organization and part of FAMILIA Trans Queer Liberation Movement that has been pushing for the last 2 years to bring this issue. And as a community, we have been going the proper, quote unquote, way to make sure the president of my administration knows what's really happening inside and how the violence, the sexual and physical abuse that is taking place, the mental abuse, right? When our sisters complain, they get put in solitary confinement, and according to ICE, it's for their safety purposes. So these are the things that, we had to go through and consider, because it wasn't we're just going to do it because he hasn't done much for the community. But I think he has so much more potential to do so much more and really help us with all this pain that we're dealing, reduce the violence that we are facing. And not only that, in addition, I want to make another very critical point for many transgender women. Marriage was not really a priority, right? For us to build loving relationships with our partner, it's really, we're facing a lot of stigma, we're facing a lot of rejection. I know many people might be ready to say we want marriage, right? We want just basic needs to survive. So that's why doing that moment, taking opportunity of that moment, that it's once in a lifetime, that I just could not waste.
Those are really excellent points, and I'm glad you shared those. So just focusing in on the big issue then, could you tell us a little bit of specifics in terms of where the violence is occurring? Since I heard you talk about the Obama administration, is it ICE officials putting the undocumented transgender women in those facilities, or where is the violence occurring? Where is it happening?
That is correct. It's happening inside immigrant detention facilities, and not only to the LGBT community, but other undocumented immigrants that come to this country seeking refugee, right? So this is a crisis. This is for specifically, I was really targeting my community because that was the main audience, but I went with the bigger message, right, that this is something that is impacting us, that the violence that we face inside this immigrant detention facility, but also that under Obama, the number of deportation has probably one of the highest in any U.S. presidency, meaning separation of families, including those whose children were born here in the U.S. So for cases that we worked with, like Nicole or Jessica, both trans women in their 20s from Guatemala, we are exposed to so much violence in society. We are exposed to rejection by loved ones because they don't really understand what is it that, why do we have to, become whatever transition or align ourselves with the gender that we identify, right? So we are already dealing with a lot of that. So many of us make the ultimate sacrifice to, again, put our lives at risk and cross borders. And when we turn ourselves in at the border, and first they go by your identification, because the system goes very limited with the gender binary, right? It's either one or the other. And because the documentation doesn't really match our gender identity, so we are locked up with the main population. So that was one of the major issues there. And that's where the pain starts, the dehumanization process began, because ICE officials don't understand it, or they don't want to give you the chance to hear where you're coming from. And, the love, the humiliation, the physical and sexual abuse that has been very well documented by the Human Rights Watch. I invite your listeners to look at the very thoroughly 70-page report where he highlights different cases of the experiences of their pain at the hands of ICE in this nation. So those are the things that are happening.